Hi everyone, thanks for jumping on. We'll allow a few minutes before we get started as um, everyone comes into the room, so bear with us. Um, Generally, we sort of move up above 200 for this, but yeah, we'll allow a couple extra minutes and then we'll kick things off.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, we might kick things off. So the session should be already recording, I believe. So when I jumped in, I think it automatically did that. So let me just share my screen. Alrighty, so hopefully everyone can see that. So thanks for coming along to our, I guess, our mandatory club AGM training. So as we've put out before, as long as your club does have representation at this live session, then there won't be any penalties. So some clubs already have reached out to both Em and I to indicate that their whole executive team cannot come, which as long as we've got notice ahead of time, we can make special arrangements. But as long as you've got at least one otherwise, then yeah, as I said, no penalties will apply. So a bit of a plan for what today will look like. Essentially, it's around planning your AGM. So as we know, all clubs, all DUSA clubs need to run an AGM in trimester two. So we're going to run through what that looks like from both the planning perspective, but also running it on the day and then what you need to do post your AGM as well. We'll send out some documentation post today's session, which will encapsulate everything that's in the slides here, along with all the templates that we've got for use that we'll go over briefly in today's session, as well as our do some manual. So hopefully you'll walk away from today, feeling pretty equipped to be able to run your club's AGM. But as always, if you do have questions post today's session, then reach out to MRI. We will have a section I guess directly following this where you can ask some questions, but naturally questions will come thereafter as well, and that's perfectly fine. So there's a bit of a overview in terms of what is an AGM. So AGM stands for Annual General Meeting, and essentially it's an overview of everything that you've done since the last AGM. So effectively, what's transpired in the last 12 months. So, looking at things like what's worked and what hasn't. So could be, doing a bit of an overview for what you've run in terms of events or initiatives, but generally that whole of club operations, it's a time to sort of reflect on that. That's it's sort of achieved primarily through the current executive team delivering an annual report. So each executive of your club need to be able to provide a written report and ideally present that at the AGM. And you should look at it as a way to be able to provide an oversight to your member base and attendance of what that last 12 months have looked like from each executive role. Now, it's also an opportunity to propose any constitutional changes. And we'll go over this a little bit later, but any constitutional changes need to be first approved by Emma or I. There's only a certain amount of things that you can propose to change. It also then needs to go to a vote and be voted on by your members. So we'll touch on that a little bit further, but that's also one of the main reasons of running your annual general meeting. And then essentially the main function will be to elect the new executive. So as you were elected, this time last year, it's that same process again in terms of electing an executive for the following 12 months or until, the next AGM in T2 next year. You can also start to discuss, opportunities and activities, initiatives for the following 12 months as well. So you might have, or the outgoing executive might have, obviously some ideas about what worked and what didn't, or potentially some focus points for the club moving forward. And so, the AGM is also through the end of the AGM in terms of discussing other club business. It's an opportunity to touch on that and be able to highlight, what could be focused on moving forward. Okay, so the other thing is it's important to note that all executives need to be both DUSA and club members at the time of the AGM. So likely a lot of the clubs have been receiving communication from Emma, myself, and other DUSA staff as well in terms of ensuring that you or your executive team are members of the club and DUSA, and that's imperative. Otherwise, yeah, essentially they won't be, or they'll be voided. Your AGM would be voided because they wouldn't be eligible to vote at your own AGM. So it's so important to make sure going into the AGM that your executives hold both a DUSA and club membership. So we really can't stress that enough. It's not just Em and I sending multiple emails to annoy you all. It is really important at this time of the year more than ever going into your AGM.
Okay, so planning your AGM, there's a bit of work that needs to go into planning it, but it's not too onerous. It's important to know that the AGM must fall on an academic day in trimester 2, so it can't be during the holidays and not during a weekend. It can be held online or on campus. We recommend online because it just gives a bigger advantage to your members and the accessibility. You'll get hopefully more attendees that way. All current club members must be notified about the upcoming AGM at least 14 days prior. So it needs to be done via email. And then we also recommend that a reminder notice is sent out 7 days prior as a reminder as well. Then an agenda, you need to put your agenda together. That agenda will compose of what you're hoping to do. So if it's only covering the election of the new executive, you're not looking to change anything within your constitution, the club's name, or remove or add any executive positions. If it's literally just the executive roles changeover, then that agenda will have that information in it. So that's important to put together and send to your members 24 hours prior to the AGM as well. Now, when you are putting together the nominations for the new executive positions, you need to send those to what we call a returning officer. A returning officer will be, you'll need to choose one for the AGM, and ideally it should be a neutral party that's not standing for an executive position. They are responsible for collecting and counting votes, and ideally the RO should not be connected to the club. Shouldn't be a previous executive, for instance, and yeah, ideally not be connected to the club. Now we know that that can sometimes be a bit tricky to find someone to take that spot. So any clubs that are having issues with with finding someone to do that, just reach out to James or myself and we can offer some suggestions. Um, um, the nominations for those executive positions need to be sent to that returning officer at least 3 days prior to the AGM as well. Um, you also nominate a chair for the meeting. Usually it'll be the president, but it doesn't have to be. They facilitate the AGM meeting and someone else to do the minutes. They're very important to keep track of, and we file those away. That then they're used in the following AGM and accepted as being a true and accurate record of the previous meeting. And that can be your secretary, but it can be another executive if you choose. That's also fine.
And just to quickly jump in here, so on this screen where you see the notice period of being at least 14 days prior and the agenda being at least 24 hours prior, so that's just from a minimum standard. You could send out, as long as everything's ready to go, you could send out your notice and your AGM earlier. You could even send out the agenda along with the notice as well. So these are just the minimum standards. So at least 24 hours, at least 14 days prior. But as I said, it can be, you can send it out earlier than that if you're ready.
And we've got a slide coming up with a timeline on it, which we put together in order to, clubs will be sending it separately and you can actually print it out and insert the dates uh, for each of those important sections above that timeline so that you have a visual representation of when you've got to send everything to us, even if that initial email goes out a lot further, as James said, much more than 14 days prior, as long as you keep track of the other timelines correctly, then yeah, you can fit that to whatever works for the club. So continuing on in terms of the planning, James and myself must approve the AGM date, the time, the location, and any proposed constitutional amendments that you put within your agenda before you send that AGM notice out to your members. And like other event packages, we allow 4 weeks. Even if it is online, we still want 4 weeks notice. That will then ensure that we can process it properly, and you've definitely got at least that 2 weeks window to send out your notice to your members. With the online platforms, we do recommend using Zoom to host your AGM. It's really handy. You can do the voting through a poll using Zoom, which makes it quite simple and easy. We also recommend you pre-register your attendees prior to the AGM to save a lot of time. The details needed will be to confirm that those taking part are actually paid club members. And your current club members, of course, you can have other members attending your AGM. But if they're not paid club members for at least 7 days prior to the AGM and longer, they are unable to vote. So that's very important that we make sure that everyone voting is eligible too. We would also suggest you have an executive member responsible for checking that attendance at the beginning of the AGM. So just even if you do a pre-register of those attendees, make sure you've got someone checking that the people that have pre-registered have actually also logged in and are part of it. Numbers can become important down the track when it comes to making changes and so on, because you have to meet quorum and ensure that a certain number of votes have been received for changes within your constitution. But we'll get to that later. And it's also in terms of the planning, it's good to work out what your voting method is going to be for both nominations and the constitutional changes. So that can be private ballot. You can use the Zoom poll, you can use SurveyMonkey, Wufoo, or even formal election-based software such as Election Runner. There's a number of different online packages that you as a club can pay for if you need to. But there are also a lot of free ones that are very, very easy to use as well.
I guess just to further hammer home that point, that uh, ability or that checking attendance is really important. So don't overlook it. So clubs in the past, I guess, have used, say, out of date member lists, and so they've thought James is a member because he was a member 6 months ago, and then by the time the AGM comes out, maybe my membership lapsed 2 weeks ago, and then so technically I'm not a member at the time of the AGM, and that hasn't been found at the point of checking attendance. So really make sure that you look at the finer detail at the start of your AGM or pre-AGM through a pre-register system. Make sure that everyone that is attending actually is a member at the time. So the way to do that is just to cross-reference, your latest membership report. And if you need a copy of that, obviously you get a copy of that on Friday mornings. But if your AGM falls outside of a Friday, for example, and you want the most recent copy, then just email MRI and we can send the latest copy through and use that, whoever the attendance checker is, or use that to cross-reference those that are attending. It's just so important to do that. If you've got essentially non-members attending and voting at your AGM, it can void it, which means you would need to rerun it. So it's really important that that's all up to date. And I guess just that last point too. So in terms of your voting method, if your club is a political club or you know that, there are it's contentious in terms of what the voting looks like, then we do recommend going down a more formal procedure. Um, so there's, as we've noted on the screen, Election Runner, Election Buddy, and a number of different platforms that clubs have used in the past, both paid and free. We'd recommend going down that path just so there's no questions around the validity of your AGM. So if you do feel like there might be hotly contested nominations, then we recommend going down that path. Em, do you want to run through this? I know you put this timeline together, which looks great. Do you want to run through it?
Forgot to unmute, sorry. So this is literally just a pictorial representation of what we've just been talking about in terms of the timeline. And I figured it might be handy to have that, for the clubs to have that. So once you've decided on your date, my mouse doesn't go over the top of it, but maybe James, if you can just put your mouse or whatever, if you can, over the top of that last box. Sorry, the green one, the AGM held. So if we use that as the date that you've chosen as your AGM, then you can work both forwards, 3 weeks forward, and put in a date for when those documents need to come to James and I, and work backwards and put the dates in, absolute latest dates for all of those other important information to come to us. So if your AGM, for instance, is going to be the 1st of October, then obviously the at least 24 hours can't be any later than the 30th of September. 3 days prior would be the 27th of September, etc., etc. So we just put that together. That's something we'll supply to everyone, all the clubs after the training today. So that if you want to print it out, I know that I'm a visual learner and work well with these sorts of things, and it can just be handy to have. So you're not having to search through dozens of emails and go backwards. You've just got it right in front of you and know that you haven't missed any deadlines and that sort of thing.
Yeah, good one. I think, yeah, definitely if you can print it out or if you can just circulate it online and then just use this to pop in your dates, that'll just sort of help you get organized pre, during, and post. So, as Em said, a lot of us are visual learners, so this can be a handy little tool. So we've sort of touched on what's needed with AGM documents, and for those that have been a part of it in the past, you'd be familiar with what's required. But for those that haven't, we do have a number of templates that essentially you can just edit to fit your club and purpose. So it's made up of a notice template, which is what we referred to earlier in terms of needing to go out at least 14 days prior. So that's what needs to go out to your members. It is what it says it is in terms of it being a notice to members to notify them of the upcoming AGM. You've got the agenda template, which just stipulates what you're covering on the day. Important to note that it looks similar to the minutes template, but post AGM, when you submit your documentation, make sure you're using the right templates for the right purpose. The agenda template is just what you send out prior to your members as a note of what you're covering on the day. The nomination template, so again, that's for the nomination of your executive positions, not your committee positions. the general positions, just your executive. You've got the attendance template to use. Again, all this is really easy to edit and use and fill in. And then the minutes template. So the minutes template is what you're going to use. So likely the secretary is the one that will use this to plug in as you're going in terms of, what you're covering and how it's fed throughout the meeting. So it's a bit of a running document. So that's the key one to fill out while your AGM's happening, or at least post AGM, that you'll send through to us. Now, we'll send all these templates to you, including the DUSA AGM manual. So the manual is basically a PDF of what we're covering today. So you'll get a copy of that with today's presentation slides, with the recording. So it's handy if you've got executives that couldn't make it for any reason, then please make sure that they do spend time having a look through the templates when we send them through to get familiar with them, particularly if you've got your attendance checker. Make sure they're across what they actually need to do, and that they're familiar with the attendance template. And then, likewise, the secretary with the minutes, etc. Share the recording, share the manual, make sure you're all aware of it. If you've got questions, then you can reach out to us. All right, so in terms of running the AGM, the first thing that you will need to do, obviously, is check off all your attendees. So we've harped on about this a little bit. I won't go over it in too much detail, but yeah, make sure that it's up to date, that you're checking the IDs. All attendees have to be a current member of your club. And I've sort of touched on already that if you've got no non-members attending and voting at your AGM, then it will void it, and you'd need to go through the whole process of rerunning it. So avoid that completely and make sure you're focusing on the finer detail. So non-deacon students, they can attend, but they just can't vote. The second thing is you need to make sure you list all the attendees and that you're able to continue on with the AGM in terms of meeting quorum. So quorum is 15% of your total paid members, or 15 members, whatever is lesser of the two. If you don't meet quorum, it just means you don't have enough members to be able to run the AGM. So you then have to go through the process of, again, running another one. So obviously, for clubs to continue on, you need buy-in from your members, both from a nomination perspective and, putting their hand up to run the club, but also participation in terms of attending meetings like the AGM. So it's really important that that is stressed when you're sending out the notice. And, a lot of you will have events that are still happening in early to mid T2 before your AGM. Get the message out around, we need your attendance at the AGM. And that's where hopefully if you're running it online, it's going to be easier to meet quorum to be able to run it. The third part there is obviously opening the meeting and listing any apologies. So anyone that's noted that they won't be able to make it. So generally, as I said, this would come down to the meeting chair, and the president would typically assume that role. The fourth thing is accepting the minutes from your club's last AGM. And so if you need a copy of these from 2023, then email MRI and we can email that across to you. Obviously, if you're a new club, so we've got quite a few new clubs this year, around 28 off the top of my head. So for a new club, you would just remove this section from the template because you didn't run an AGM last year, so you can bypass that. The sixth part or the next part, sorry, should be fifth, to distribute your club constitution, and to consider and vote on any proposed amendments. So you can circulate the club constitution even prior as well. When you do that, just make sure that you're removing any of the privacy information in Schedule 1, so your contact details of your executive team. Just hide that. Obviously, you don't want to circulate that to everybody. And then obviously, as I said, considering and voting on any proposed amendments. And we'll touch on what that can look like in a couple of slides' time. So the sixth thing would be to deliver your annual report. So as we've noted, the executive team need to be able to deliver an annual report on their role. Now, often we get questions around, oh, well, what should this include? It can be both it can have both a professional and personal element to it. So, the president can give sort of a bit of an overview into the year, a whole of picture type report. But it's also fine if the individual wants to, give a personal touch to it in terms of, oh, this is what I found, this is what I enjoyed. I think it's good to be able to pass that on. So, the treasurer obviously is going to mainly report on the financial aspect of it. And then the secretary generally is going to be more around the administrative duties, listing maybe what the member report was last year, how it's grown or declined, and then any other duties as well. So it varies from club to clubs. Obviously, a lot of clubs will have additional roles on top of that. So whether it's social media coordinator or events officer, etc., they all need to provide a report on their role as well. So the next thing would be to appoint the returning officer as well. So as we've noted, needs to be a neutral party. So again, yeah, if you're having issues trying to find an RO, then yeah, contact MRI and we can chat in more detail with you. But again, their main role is realistically to collect and count the votes. So, you want someone that is going to be completely neutral and that you're not going to get any questions about the validity of it again. So, ideally, yeah, it needs to be someone that isn't tied to the club, but we understand that that's not always possible. So, have a chat with us if you need to about that. The next part will be voting in the new executive committee, which is fairly straightforward. We'll touch on the nuances of that in a couple of slides as well. And then the last thing, sort of before you close the meeting, is just touching on any general business. So I mentioned at the start of this session in terms of, whether it's focus areas for the club or, anything that you kind of want to share. Maybe it's an upcoming event that's happening that, you want to disclose some more info on. Any club related business you can chuck in at the end here before you then finally close off on the meeting. And look, some of this, don't feel sort of overpowered by the information that we're providing you today. Once you see the templates, hopefully that'll lay it out a lot easier for you. And so, using the minutes as an example, that'll kind of make a lot more sense when you see that.
So constitutional changes, we mentioned earlier, in addition to voting in the new executive, the AGM is an opportunity for clubs to make constitutional changes. So those changes can include changing the club name, what the purpose of the club is, either adding or removing executive roles if you feel like you've got too many, too little, or changing the ones that you've currently got. We've had discussions with various clubs on that matter. We do recommend, if you can, for clubs to have an odd number of executives because that makes it easier when you need to vote on things. You're less likely to have a tie and that sort of thing, but it's not essential. But it also is an opportunity to change what the roles and responsibilities of those proposed executive and current executive positions are. The other thing that can happen is change of membership fees, club membership fees. The AGM is an ideal time to do that. So if you feel that your club expenses have increased significantly over the last 12 months, you may want to look at increasing the membership fees for the following year to just help support the financial viability of the club. Now, if you do make those constitutional changes in addition to the executive change, those constitutional changes require a vote in favour of 75% or more of the eligible voters for it to pass. Okay, so that's obviously a calculation that needs to be made at the time in terms of how many people have logged on and are eligible to vote. Then 75% of those have to also agree to those changes to be made and for it to be passed. And that voting can be done via a show of hands or via a separate poll if you're doing it with the software allows that.
And just to quickly add on, so the one thing that you can't change is adding or is sort of removing the three essential roles. So that's the president, treasurer, and secretary. So they have to remain unchanged.
Thanks, James. Yeah. Okay, so voting in the new executive. So at your AGM, every executive position is up for election. So those all the positions that currently make up your club constitution. So if that's three positions, then all three. If it's five, it's all five. If you're one of the constitutional changes you want to make is to remove some of those executive positions, then that would make sense to handle that as part of your agenda first. So then when it comes to the voting, you're not voting for an executive that won't exist at the end of the meeting. So, but all of your members would know about that anyway because of the notice period. So only Deakin students who are current club members are eligible to vote, as James mentioned earlier. And as we also said, they must be a member at least 7 days prior to the AGM. Anyone who joins within that 7 days prior is not eligible to vote. Proxies are also not permitted as far as the voting. It's important that students hoping to become executives must be an enrolled student for the entirety of the year in their new position. If this is not going to be the case, if you are only going to be at Deakin for another 2 trimesters and the end of the year falls in that third trimester and you're no longer going to be a student, then you shouldn't be putting your hand up to be an executive in the club. It's very important. We've had a number of situations where executives have finished their course and they've left the club because they're no longer at the uni, and that's then left that particular club's executive sort of up in the air because they've suddenly lost at least one, if not more, of their executives. So that's very, very important that anyone that nominates to be an executive needs to be an enrolled student for the entire time. If only one person has put their hand up and been nominated for a position, they are automatically elected into that position. But then you will also need one person to move that motion during the meeting and another to second the motion. If more than one person nominates for a role, the best practice is then to hold a private vote. All private votes must be provided to the returning officer for counting. And then if voting is tied for a particular position, then members will be asked to vote again.
Yeah, what we should also add on is that this is primarily for unincorporated clubs. We do have a handful of clubs that are incorporated, and so you will have your own constitution of which you should follow. So generally, clubs that are incorporated, for example, will allow proxies. So if that's you, if you're one of the incorporated clubs, then just make sure you're following your own constitution with respect to that. Um, the other thing as well, you can take nominations from the floor. So, for example, you might get, let's say you get one nomination for president, one nomination for treasurer, but none for secretary. You can take nominations from the floor during the AGM. But that's only if you haven't received any nominations for that position 3 days prior. So, for example, you can't, if you've got a nomination for a role, you can't just then go at the AGM and ask for anyone else if they're interested to put their hand up. It's only when in the case where you haven't got any nominations that you can accept from the floor. In terms of voting methods, so there's a few different ways that you can do that. So the first is just quite casual. It's a non-private ballot. So this would typically mean a show of hands. It could also mean using Zoom poll. Uh, but for example, well, sorry, I should say Zoom poll is probably something that's a little bit more somewhat formal. The casual method we wouldn't typically recommend. Now, the reason why we wouldn't recommend a show of hands is that potentially if we have a vote between Em and I, and 10 people put their hand up for Emma and none put their hand up for James, it might make James feel a little bit unwanted, and it can be a little bit awkward. So for that reason, we always would encourage clubs to go down a more semi-private or private-based system as opposed to a show of hands. When it's constitutional changes, go for your life in terms of show of hands. But otherwise, yeah, take into account how someone might feel. if they don't receive any votes or very few votes. So, for example, somewhat formal, that would be Zoom poll, or it could be like a Survey Monkey or Wufoo or something like that. Might be even if you're running it on campus, then you could do essentially names on a paper, which you would then hand to the returning officer. The returning officer would then, count the votes and announce those who have been successful in being elected to the positions. So that would be somewhat formal. The formal method would be using a dedicated election software, like we touched on before with Election Buddy and so forth, Election Runner. Now, generally, there will be a cost. There might be some that are free. Now, I think for some clubs, it's definitely advantageous to go down the formal path. We find generally most of our clubs will sort of use that somewhat formal method. Lastly, as well, just on this slide, you'll see that there's no need to publicly announce the number of votes either. So, worth having that discussion with your returning officer. So when they are announcing, who wins, they don't need to say, Emma has been elected president with 10 votes, James only received zero. They can just make, Emma has been successful in being nominated to the role of president.
Okay, so after you've held your AGM, within 3 weeks of that AGM, you need to submit the following information to James and myself. So the first thing there is your AGM minutes need to be fully completed, the attendance list from the AGM, the annual reports that were presented by the executive, the updated club constitution. So that will include any constitutional changes that were made in addition to the executive changes, whichever they may be. If the whole executive was changed, all of those new details need to be included in that updated club constitution. And also we need a new copy of the affiliation agreement signed by the incoming president and one other incoming executive. And it's important to note there that electronic signatures are accepted, but typed signatures are not. Obviously, handwritten ones, also, if you're doing it on campus, are fine. Now, this is also really important, and it doesn't happen probably as much as we would hope for. The outgoing club executives, wherever possible, should complete a handover to their incoming or the future year club executives. The new executive term commences immediately following that AGM. So the new executives start from the moment the AGM is completed. In part of that handover process, we'd encourage you to hand over the club assets. That will include your online passwords, the email accounts, any equipment and merchandise, and so on. You need to provide a club assets register, which details all of the current club property and also where these items are located. So that might be on campus. It shouldn't remain at somebody else's house if they're no longer an executive. That all needs to be handed over, including the list of what's part of that asset register. Meetings would ideally be then held between the outgoing and the incoming executives to go over any details relating to their roles, club processes, and so on. Many of your new executives will be doing it for the first time. So other than, whatever information they might obtain during that meeting and the AGM might be their first exposure to what it's going to be like to be part of the club executive. And so the more information and wisdom that you can pass on to those newcoming executives will be really great for the club because obviously knowledge is power, and you're going to be able to have a better year ahead in terms of organisation, planning, and that sort of thing if your incoming executives are well versed and knowledgeable of what their what their responsibilities are, and to manage those expectations. It's also important to review what the club's minimum requirements are, including the DUSA processes and getting familiar with the club resources on the landing page, the DUSA website there. that will include things like the forms that we require when planning events and that sort of thing. But any amount of wisdom that you can pass on to the incoming executive will only benefit them and the club in the future.
So ideally, once your AGM is finished, you should sort of get together the outgoing and incoming. And even if it's not a meeting that goes over all this detail in this slide, but at least set a time for when you can come together to be able to complete the handover. If you leave it for, oh yeah, we'll touch base, often what happens or what we find is that, the outgoing team go on and graduate, maybe they go back home, they get busy, and then the handover never really happens. So realistically, the best way to do it is at the end of the AGM, come together and either, get it done in terms of the complete handover or set a date for when you will all come together to be able to do it. It's just so important because otherwise, as some of you would have realized this year, if you get to, March and you're only just starting to sort of piece things together at that point, you really are playing catch up. And it can be hard to catch up at that point. You really want to sort of hit the ground running post the AGM so that, when January rolls around, you're really ready to roll. And obviously, we've got some medical clubs here as well, and their timelines start even earlier. So for a lot of the medical clubs, you really can't afford to fall behind, given, you're sort of really getting up and going in that January period. So key timelines here that we've put together. So some of these have already been sent out as well, but 2nd of September is what we've noted as the deadline for submitting your AGM packages. So again, really be aware of these dates, discuss these as a team, print out the timeline or at least be across the timeline and put together in an earlier slide and slot these in so that you're really aware of it and you're planning accordingly. And then the 25th of October, that's the latest that your AGM can be held. So the reason
Um,
why it's the 25th of October or in October is because post that there's 3 weeks that you have to be able to submit your post AGM documentation. So that effectively takes us to sort of, that mid to late November period, noting that, mid-December, the DUSA offices close and finish up for the year. So there's not much time in between. So if you need to either rerun your AGM or there's documentation that M&I need you to amend or follow up on, then it really can't be too much later than that 25th of October timeframe.
if I can just jump in for a sec, James, we are noticing that there's a lot of questions coming in the chat there, which we'll address shortly. But I did notice that one of them that came up indicated that the 25th of October is outside the study period, is actually after the academic classes have completed. So I don't know whether we need to revise that date and bring it back a week. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, look, I think it's okay for now. So I know we sort of stipulate that it has to be held during TT. So the reason why it's sort of extended a little bit, the medical clubs operate on a semester-based system, so it's a little bit different to, I guess, mainstream. So that's why sort of alterations have been made in that point. So I don't think we need to change it. And an extra week sometimes can allow clubs um, a grace period or time to be able to rerun a second AGM if needed, which we do find there's always a number of clubs each year that need that. So, if I'm a club, even though it's sort of late October as a deadline, realistically, you want to hold it kind of August if you can, because that then allows you time to be able to rerun another one if you need to. If you run your or plan to run your AGM on the 20th of October, and it falls over and you don't meet quorum or for whatever reason it's voided, then you've got no time to be able to rerun a second one. So as much as we say this is the deadline, realistically, you should be looking to run your AGM earlier before later.
And it's also, I think, worth reiterating here that there are a number of clubs that have reached out to me over the last couple of months when there's been some executive issues in terms of missing execs and so on because they have left or decided that they are unable to commit to their role anymore. If you're one of the clubs that's facing that and you've got multiple vacancies within your executive, we would encourage you to hold your AGM sooner rather than later. Obviously, you'll still have to have that 4 weeks notice to present the documents to us to process and so on. But if you're in that position, then it might be worth getting together and starting to plan that post our meeting today, once we send you all the documents, and get that done sooner rather than later, because ideally we don't want clubs to be running with with less than the minimum number of executives in some cases, and with big gaping vacancies within their executive, because it's not going to make it fair for those that are still left behind to organise things and run the club effectively.
Alrighty, so we might jump into some questions. So, Em, feel free to do the same, and we might just try and chew through a few pretty quick. So, one of them I've got, um, does a returning officer have to be a club member? So no, they just have to be neutral. So, as I said, reach out if you do have issues in trying to find one. Potentially either a staff member or potentially even student council might be able to assist your club if needed. Another question is, will the slides be sent out in a post-meeting email? Yeah, they will be. So give us around 24 hours, and we'll send out the slides, the recording, and the DUSA manual and the templates. So definitely have a look at those and circulate those to anyone from your team that wasn't able to make it.
We've got a question there. Aside from execs, do attendees only need to be paid club members, not DUSA members? That's correct. At a minimum, they have to be paid club members. If they're additionally DUSA members, that has no bearing on the AGM voting. But they definitely have to be paid club members for more than 7 days prior to the AGM. Similar to a shareholder meeting, can the exec board give recommendations as to how to vote on proposed amendments? Oh, that's a tricky one. Do you know how to cover that one, James?
Let me have a look.
Why do I feel like that might be a incorporated club query? I'd say that'll come down to your own constitution if you're one of the incorporated clubs.
Probably need a little bit more detail in terms of, yeah, what you mean. So maybe reach out at a current to either myself or M, and we can tease that out a little bit further just to get a bit more detail.
I've got a question. If we're holding an AGM online, how should we get signatures for attendance if typed signatures are not accepted? When we talked about the typed signatures, that's for the new affiliation agreement for the president and one of the other executives, not for attendance. So that's a bit separate, and only applies to that affiliation agreement.
So bear with me. My screen's froze, so I can't seem to scroll. If you can, Em, just feel free to read out the questions.
Sure. We've got another one. Does this process include amending a club's bylaws?
So that would be, yeah, you'd have to have a look at your constitution, Felicity. So from memory, I think you might be from the law club. So have a closer read and a look at, yeah, the bylaws there.
Still frozen, James. I'll keep going, reading them if you want.
My wheel's still spinning.
Okay, we've got hello team. If we want to add an executive post like vice president, also can we do that on AGM? Absolutely. That is the time to add the additional executive positions. You just need to put that in your proposed agenda that you send out to James or myself in advance of while you're in those planning stages. And if we agree that the proposal is warranted, then yes, that'll form part of your agenda.
I could see one of the questions, even though it came back for a little bit on my screen and now it's frozen again. But one of the questions I got was, can executives run for re-election? Yes, they can. So as long as they are still continuing on their studies and are current students for the duration of the following 12 months, then yeah, they can definitely re-nominate and be re-elected.
Um, can we arrange an AGM both online and on campus?
Yeah, definitely. So you can do the hybrid model for sure. So you'd have to still send a located event request package, and I guess as part of the room booking form, you just indicate that you need, yeah, the ability to stream.
Given the new executive assumes command immediately following the AGM, how does this affect T2 and T3 club events? Is the existing executive allowed to aid in running these events? Absolutely. They'd just be assisting in a club member capacity if they're not coming back as an executive themselves or as a general, like another committee position. But absolutely, they assist in those events.
Really good question. Work well in the past is upcoming where the team essentially almost work together for the event before then completely like so that can actually hand over. So obviously, when you do processes, have a leading hand in terms of how that can work quite well.
Is this the one you honours students continue in their exec role?
I haven't answered it, but yeah, they can.
Yeah, the one we did earlier or not. All that I've got coming up. Got any other questions? On in.
So yeah, definitely, as I mentioned, for some of those incorporate your separate constitution, there'll be a few things that be a little bit different, even in terms. I think generally quorum, through 10%, but have be some variances. Em and I will pay more attention to those when you send through your AGM package, just to make sure that you are adhering to your own constitution. But yeah, just make sure you're familiar with that because some of the detail will be a little bit different to what we covered today. Right, I'm still frozen, so I'm not sure if are there any other questions coming through, Em?